Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The House Armed Services Committee is pushing back against President Trump's executive order that removes collective bargaining rights for civilian workers in the Defense Department. Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis joins me with more details. Anastasia, great to have you.
Hi, Terry.
What is the core issue here that we're talking about?
Yeah, so HASC last week adopted an amendment offered by Congressman Donald Norcross to ban the Defense Department's use of fiscal 2027 funds to implement the president's executive order. A similar provision was introduced in 2026. However, it was ultimately stripped from the final version of the bill. But this particular amendment, it passed 30-26. So we had Representatives Mike Turner, Don Bacon, and Derek Van Orden. They sided with Democrats to support this measure. The issue has become a point of contention now as House and Senate lawmakers negotiate a final version of the 2027 NDAA, especially given how aggressively this administration has been executing its union-busting campaign. The Defense Department civilian employees are, of course, the latest to lose their collective bargaining rights, but Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth canceled virtually all agreements back in April. But at the same time, many agencies, including the Department of Veterans Affairs, FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the Environmental Protection Agency, have moved to strip their workers of collective bargaining rights. Here's Congressman Norcross.
This is the largest single rollback of federal labor rights in modern American history. This is such recklessness that we in Congress, and more importantly, the American people, have been shown that the suspension of collective bargaining agreements was not, in fact, a national security issue, but just another step by this administration to make harm of our employees. In fact, what happened when Defense Secretary Hegseth was here, I literally asked him the question, are there any issues, were there any problems with any collective bargaining agreement that were covered by DoD? He could not cite one example of where this was an issue, and that's why we are here today.
Anastasia, I mean, no one really disputes that the president has the authority to exclude federal agencies from collective bargaining given national security priorities. So why are they pushing back so hard now against this executive order?
Yeah, like you said, presidents have had this explicit statutory authority for a very long time that allows them to exclude agencies and subdivisions from the federal labor relations statute if, of course, federal agencies' primary mission is intelligence, counterintelligence, investigative, or national security work. Overall, what the administration argues is that evolving foreign and domestic threats have broadened the scope of what constitutes national security work. And given that, agencies need greater flexibility to respond quickly to emerging challenges without being bogged down by things like collective bargaining obligations, grievance procedures, etc. And of course, previous presidents have used this authority. President Carter excluded parts of the NSA. President George W. Bush excluded certain parts of the Justice Department from collective bargaining rights, also citing national security concerns. However, that was never an issue the way it is an issue today. What's different is the scope. The administration says that it's up to the executive branch what the scope is. And ultimately, the president is the one who was elected to make these national security decisions. And Congress gave presidents that ability. But the unions kind of came back and said the statute was supposed to be very narrow in nature. It was supposed to be a narrow exception rather than this sweeping authority to remove bargaining rights across very large segments of the federal workforce. Congress wrote it for agencies in subdivisions like with functions of national security, but not functions like regulatory, administrative, or scientific. So presidents So what they're saying is that the president cannot really use this narrow exception to swallow this entire rule. But there's also another part to it, which is the political reality, where this administration is very open about managing the federal workforce very aggressively.
You mentioned the vote count, and it was pretty close. So not everybody in the committee was in agreement. For folks who voted against the amendment, what was their argument?
Yeah, this was passed very narrowly. Republicans are opposed to this, are arguing that these decisions to manage the workforce of National Security Agency should be made by the president. After all, Congress did give presidents this authority, and it's in the president's hands. Here's Republican Congressman Mike Rogers. He's the House Armed Services Committee chairman.
This amendment, in my view, unnecessarily restricts the president's authority to manage the workforce of our national security agencies, including the Department of Defense. The president is well within his authority granted by the Civil Service Reform Act to limit collective bargaining with federal unions that have a national security mission. In fact, he is not the first president to do so. Previous presidents have used the national security exemption to prohibit collective bargaining with the CIA and other national security agencies. Therefore, I regrettably have to oppose my good friend's amendment.
And I also wanted to include Secretary HASC's views on unionizing at the Defense Department. It's pretty succinct.
I fundamentally believe the Department of War should not be subject to collective bargaining, full stop.
You're right. Pretty succinct. What's next here?
Yeah, so this was only passed by the House Armed Services Committee. We'll see if the measure even survives on the floor. And like I mentioned, a similar measure was introduced last year, and there were many House Republicans urging Senate Republicans to support the measure, but ultimately there was only one Republican senator who pushed for the inclusion of this measure. So we'll see what happens next.
That's Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. Thanks for keeping us up to date.
Thank you, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com.